The diaspora has a problem, a savior problem, a superiority problem. A problem we've inherited without even knowing it, but one that shapes everything about how we see Africa. For example, it's when someone says, one day I'll go back and fix things. You hear it when people talk about helping the quote unquote villagers. You see it in the way we romanticize the idea of giving back without even asking who's already doing the work on the ground. We grew up thinking Africa was waiting on us, waiting for our degrees, our ideas, our Western exposure. But the thing is, Africa has never been waiting for us. Africa has been building without us, but we were raised to believe the opposite. Not because we were arrogant by nature, but because the West trained us to be. From childhood, we were fed a single narrative. Africa equates the problem, the West equates the solution. And we, the immigrants, children caught between both worlds, become the bridge, the gifted ones, the ones expected to return with tools to save our people. So the diaspora grew up loving Africa through a lens of pity. And pity is not love. Pity is hierarchy. Pity is distance. Pity is superiority disguised as compassion. Welcome back to They Lied About Africa. I'm your host, Numbe, and if nobody told you the real story, I will. Today's episode falls under our Diaspora and Belonging series, which is a series or pillar or whatever you want to call it, where we face the uncomfortable truths about identity, disconnection, and the ways colonial narratives essentially shape how we see ourselves and the homeland. And this pillar matters because belonging isn't just about where you're from, it's about how you see the place you are from. And for many of us in the diaspora, that vision has been distorted, sanitized, pity-coded, filtered through charity commercials, school textbooks, and Western newsrooms that make Africa look so broken so the West can feel whole. But the thing is, belonging requires truth. And the truth is, you cannot belong to a place you secretly think you are above. So here's how today's episode is going to unfold. First, we're going to break down how the West conditioned the diaspora to see Africa as helpless through classrooms, media, and the non-profit industry that built billion-dollar empires on African suffering. Then we'll expose the consequences, what happens when diaspora youth return home with savior energy instead of cultural understanding. And finally, we'll talk about the shift, how we can move from savior to student, from outsider to partner, from Africa needs me to Africa knows itself, but I'm here to contribute, not lead. Because here's the realest thing you will ever hear today, maybe this week or this entire month. Africa does not need saving, but the diaspora desperately needs unlearning. So let's get into it. You know, after thinking about all of that, the next question becomes, where did we even get these ideas from? Because none of us woke up at 12 years old saying, yeah, Africa definitely needs me to save it. That didn't come from us. We learned it. And that's what's crazy. It's that most of us learned it without even realizing it. So when you grow up in the West, whether it's in the US, Canada, France, the UK, wherever you are, you don't learn about Africa from Africans. You learn about Africa from Western institutions, unless you attended an institution that was adamant on teaching you about Africa from African writers, news outlets, etc. And right there, that's the issue. Think about school. Every time Africa came up, what did they show you? Famine, civil wars, child soldiers, diseases, slums, and in the context of the United States, slavery. And then maybe, if your teacher felt generous, one unit on Egyptian pyramids or Mali, but even that was rushed through. They never showed us functioning cities, successful African governments, African innovators or African scholars. They never taught you that Senegal had one of the oldest democratic systems in West Africa, or that Tanzania built one of the fastest growing Swahili tech hubs, or that Rwanda became one of the cleanest and most digitally advanced countries on the continent. None of that made it in the curriculum. So your first introduction to Africa was already filtered, and not by accident. Now think about TV. Unless your parents had satellite channels or African movies at home, I know mine did, but I didn't really watch them all the time. What did you see? You saw the UNICEF commercials, the ones with dramatic music, the sad kids, the flies on their faces. You saw news clips of Africa as if the entire continent was one single country, as if Africa was a monolith. And notice how the clip was always from the worst possible moment. A flood, a drought, a protest, a war zone. Never the normal everyday life of Africans just living, thriving, building. Add that to Hollywood movies, where Africa is either a safari or a disaster zone, and you can see how little by little the idea sinks in. Africa is struggling. Africa is behind. Africa needs saving. And this affects you even if your parents are African, because most immigrant parents didn't even have the time or emotional space to tell you the full story. They were in survival mode, working, adjusting, trying to make life stable. They weren't sitting you down trying to explain pre-colonial history, the richness of African societies, or how the West benefits from portraying Africa the way it does. They might have tried, but so you learned Africa through the Western lens by default. And here's another example. Growing up, many of us had teachers who say things like, "You're so lucky to be here," or "You must be so grateful your parents brought you to America." Comments like that, they may seem harmless, but I promise you, they reinforce a very specific message. That message is the West saved you from Africa. And once that idea is planted, even if you don't mean to, you start believing the opposite too. I need to save Africa back. You might not even say it out loud, but it just shows up in the way members of the diaspora think. One day I'll go build a school. I'll go back and teach them how to do business. Africa would be so better if they just listened to us. But where did we learn that we know better? From a system that has spent decades convincing us that Africans are struggling and we are the ones who made it? And if we're going to be 100% honest, we have to acknowledge that yes, Africa has challenges, but the narrative we grew up was designed to make those challenges look like the whole story. And when you only see the struggle, you start thinking the struggle defines the continent. And that's exactly how the savior mentality forms. Not because the diaspora is arrogant, but because the West shaped our image of Africa long before we even had the chance to see it ourselves. And this is where it comes from. Again, school, media, movies, nonprofits, everyday comments, all reinforcing this same idea. And once you understand this, you start to realize that the savior mindset did not come from a place of evil. It came from misinformation, from gaps in our upbringing, from growing up with a version of Africa that was not complete. And this is the foundation we need to unlearn, because if you do not understand where your ideas come from, you cannot change how you show up. And I think it's important to add just one more thing here, and not to blame anyone, or not to generalize, or not to say all type of foreign aid is bad, but just to understand the system we all grew up seeing. So over the past few decades, more than $1.2 trillion in development aid has been sent to Africa. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's not an exaggeration. It's the estimate reported by organizations like the OECD, the UN, and major development researchers. And a lot of people don't realize that when money moves at that scale, it creates an entire global industry around it. That industry includes NGOs, UN agencies, contractors, consultants, headquarters in Western capitals, fundraising teams, security companies, all of it. And when experts break down where the money actually goes, they point out something important. In many cases, a large percentage of aid funding is spent within the Western institutions themselves, not because of bad intentions, but because of how the system is structured. Salaries, logistics, planning, travel, administration, consulting fees, marketing, everything it takes to run these organizations. So when we're talking about the aid industry, we're not talking about individual people trying to do harm. We're talking about the scale of the system and the economic structures behind it. Africa became the emotional center of global fundraising model, the images of need, the emergency campaigns, the charity commercials, and the model eventually grew into a billion-dollar ecosystem. And again, this doesn't mean that all NGOs are corrupt or that aid is unnecessary. I know quite a few are doing some amazing work on the ground. It just means that the way Africa has been represented, especially to the people in the West and the diaspora, has been shaped by a very real industry built around crisis, urgency, and suffering. And the reason I'm saying this is because when you grow up seeing Africa through that lens, it influences your emotional connection to the continent without you even realizing it. And I want to pause right there for a second, because this is where things get personal. We talked about the systems, the schools, the media, the nonprofits, the aid industry, but now I want to talk about what all of that actually did to us, because it is one thing to learn a narrative, but it's another thing to carry it. For a lot of us in the diaspora, we didn't just learn these ideas about Africa. We absorbed them without even noticing. They shaped how we saw the continent before we even had the chance to build our own relationship with it. And what ends up happening is subtle. You start loving Africa from a distance, but the version of Africa you're loving is the version you were shown, not the version that actually exists. You don't realize it at the time, but then you start to develop this quiet sense of pity or guilt or responsibility, not because you think you're better, but because you were taught to associate Africa with suffering first and humanity second. And when that's your starting point, it affects everything. You feel connected to the continent, but disconnected from its reality. You feel pride in where you're from, but also shame because of what you were taught it lacks. You want to belong to Africa, but you only ever saw the parts of Africa the West chose to highlight. And that's the tricky thing about this narrative. Most of us didn't grow up with the full picture, so we filled in the gaps with the only images we had. For some people, that shows up as fear of going back, fear of not fitting in, fear of being judged for not speaking the language or not knowing the culture. For others, it shows up as trying to fix things, even when we've never lived there long enough to understand what needs fixing. It also shows up in the way we talk. We say things like, one day I want to build something back home, or I want to go help the kids, or I want to show people in Africa a different way. And again, the intention is not bad. It usually comes from love, but it's love shaped by a Western lens, not by lived experience. And because of that, the relationship becomes complicated. complicated. You feel like Africa is yours, but also not yours. You feel responsible for it, but also distant from it. You want to be seen as someone who belongs, but you are raised to see yourself as someone who needs to give something before you deserve to belong. And I think if we are being a little honest, that's the emotional burden many diaspora kids carry. This unspoken belief that our value to Africa is measured by what we can bring back, not simply who we are. So what I want to explore next is what happens when this internal conflict meets the real world, when diaspora people actually go back home or talk to the people on the continent or try to reconnect, because that's where the tension gets real. And that's where the savior mindset, even unintentionally, starts to affect our relationships, our expectations, and the way we show up. Actually, and before moving on to that, I'm going to be real with you. I'm not saying any of this from a distance. I felt this before too. There was a time in my life where growing up, I only seen this image of Africa. Before I even went to Africa for the first time, or Senegal for the first time, I thought Africa was poor and that there were animals running all over the streets and things of that sort. And then when I went back for the first time, my eyes were open. But then again, when I went on this trip, I didn't even see for real how people were living. I mean, I did to a certain extent, but for the most part, I was going to all the tourist spots. Monument de la Renaissance, the zoo and all of these tourist spots. And because of this, I grew up thinking that Africa had no potential and that Africa was the way that it was for a reason, but part of me also enjoyed it. But I think because I sat in that feeling of enjoying it, but questioning why my parents left, it kind of pushed me to study things like international relations and political science and to really understand why they left. Now, I'm saying this to say that, okay, I definitely had that experience, but if I did not take the time to think about that, I would have simply went the other way and just thought, oh, Africa is poor and I was born in the West and I have all these opportunities and experiences and I'm going to bring it back home because it needs saving and I have what they do not have. No, if anything, they have everything that we have. They just don't have the platform, if that makes sense. So instead of going head on and just trying to fix something and bring some sort of an idea, I studied it. I went to school for it. And even after coming out of school, I'm still contributing to that by talking about it, creating this podcast, doing research for myself and sharing my knowledge with everyone, bringing on guests who are actually making change on the ground and not just doing it for the sake of their ego and having them share their experiences, mostly for myself, but also for you guys to see and understand what is going on. Okay, so let's move on from that. I just wanted to share that because I thought it was important. I don't want to sound like I have a superiority complex or that I'm better than anyone, because even me myself had that same mindset at one point in time. But I did the work to make sure I understood what was going on in the ground before trying to think of any way to build something back home. And to this day, I still am trying to think of ideas, but I don't want to do anything until I'm certain, until I go on the ground and I ask people what's going on if they really need something that I'm trying to bring. But once you understand how all of this shaped us internally, the next question sometimes becomes, what happens when we finally go back or try to reconnect or try to help? And this is where reality hits, because a lot of us don't realize that this savior mindset doesn't stay in your head. It leaks into your behavior. You go home for the first time in years, you see challenges you weren't expecting, and before you know what, you're thinking, if only they did things this way. And you don't mean to sound arrogant, but to someone who lives there, it can feel like you're offering solutions to a life you never lived. You spend 2 weeks there, maybe a month. That's not even enough. And they've spent their entire life navigating systems, politics, culture, expectations. So when the diaspora shows up with quick fixes or comparisons to the West, people can feel dismissed or misunderstood, even when your intention is love. And another thing that happens is disappointment. A lot of us in the diaspora expect to feel instantly at home, but instead they feel out of place. If you want to listen to an episode on that, by the way, I have an episode called The Motherland Did Not Feel Like My Mother. And I think it'd be really interesting to listen to that as it connects to what we're talking about. But not because they don't belong, but because they were imagining a version of Africa that was built from fragments. Again, those narratives you were taught about Africa in school, the charity ads you see on TV, maybe the small vacations that you went on, and stories from their parents. So when the real Africa doesn't match the imagined one, the gap creates confusion and sometimes even tension. But here's the truth. People back home are not waiting to be saved, y'all. They're already building, innovating, solving problems in the way the West rarely acknowledges. What they really actually want from the diaspora is not superiority. It's curiosity. Not here's what you should do, but what's already happening and how can I support it in a way that makes sense? And that shift from assuming to listening, from leading to learning, is what creates real connection between the diaspora and the continent. Now, after everything we have just unpacked, the narratives we learned, the emotions they created, the tension that they cause when we go back, the question becomes, so what now? What does showing up for Africa actually look like? Because if there's one thing I want you to take from this episode, it's that loving Africa doesn't require you to save it. Loving Africa requires you to understand it. And that starts with the mindset shift, a small one, but a powerful one. And instead of walking in with answers, walk in with curiosity. Instead of assuming you know what people need, ask them what they're already doing. Instead of feeling guilty about being in the diaspora, recognize that you have a different role to play, not a superior one, just a different one. Because the truth is, Africa is not waiting for the diaspora to come fix it for the millionth time. Africa is already moving. There are innovators, activists, entrepreneurs, artists, and leaders doing the work every single day, quietly, consistently, without needing to be centered. Your job is not to outshine them. Your job is to learn from them, support them, amplify them, and collaborate with them in ways that make sense. And sometimes that support is not financial or flashy. Sometimes it's learning the history your school never taught you, unlearning stereotypes, engaging with African thinkers, African media, African scholarship. Sometimes it's simply reconnecting with your own roots, your language, your culture, your family, so that you can understand the context you are stepping into. And when you do contribute, do it with intention, do it with humility, do it knowing that the diaspora doesn't have all the answers, and that's okay. Impact isn't about walking in as the hero. It's about being part of a much bigger story. That's why I created this podcast, because too many of us were handed an incomplete picture of Africa, and we've been trying to reconnect with the continent we were taught to pity instead of understand. If you want to build something real belonging, real community, real progress, we have to start from the truth, not emotion, from learning, not leading. So as you move forward, whether you want to return, invest, build, collaborate, or just reconnect, do it thoughtfully. Do it with respect for the people who already call the continent home. Do it from a place of partnership, not pity. Because Africa does not need saviors for the millionth time. Africa needs its people, present, informed, connected, and committed. And if nobody ever told you this, let me say it clearly right now. You do not have to save Africa to belong to it. You just have to show up humbly, honestly, and with the willingness to learn. And that wraps up today's conversation. This was another episode of They Lied About Africa. If you enjoyed this episode, take some time to check out the other ones I've released so far, especially if you're just starting this journey of unlearning and reconnecting. I've had conversations with change makers on the ground. I've broken down climate change in Africa, unpacked the crisis happening in Sudan at this current moment in time, explored stories like why the Gambia is inside of Senegal, and even walked through the real history behind things like the Berlin Conference. Wherever you start to decide, I promise you'll learn something that you were not taught in school, okay? And make sure you follow They Lied About Africa on TikTok and Instagram. That's where you'll get early releases, behind the scenes content, and more conversations to keep you thinking. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.